take it away.
Welcome to the poetry reading by Martín Espada. My name is Oscar Sarmiento. I am a professor in modern languages at SUNY Potsdam and the current chair of modern languages as well. It's our honor to have here poet Martín Espada, and we need to thank first the LoKo Art Festival for including this poetry reading as part of the sessions that we will have this week. Without that support, Martín Espada wouldn't be here with us and couldn't have attended my class session this afternoon. So we will have at the end of the poetry reading a few minutes for you to include your questions. So please feel free to do so once we have finished with the reading. I have had the pleasure of working along with Martín. I have, in particular, translated one of his books, and soon enough we will have a second publication in Mexico of a book by bilingual book in the end. And so it's very special and for me to have Martín here. It's a very unique occasion. I'm so glad that we can actually make this happen for all of us, not only for the campus community, but for the local community as well. So welcome, welcome here. Martín Espada has published more than 20 books as a poet, editor, essayist, and translator. His new book of poems from Norton is called Floaters. Other books of poems include Vivas to Those Who Have Failed, 2016, The Travel Ball, 2011, The Republic of Poetry, 2006, and Alabanza, 2003. He's the editor of What Save Us, Poems of Empathy and Outrage in the Age of Trump, 2019. He has received the Ruth Lilly Poetry Prize, the Shelley Memorial Award, the Robert Cleary Award, an Academy of American Poets Fellowship, the Penn Repson Fellowship, and a Guggenheim Fellowship. The Republic of Poetry was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. The title poem of his collection, Alabanza, about 9/11, has been widely anthologized and performed. His book of essays and poems, Zapata's Disciple, was banned in Tucson as part of the Mexican-American Studies program outlawed by the state of Arizona and reissued by Northwestern. A former tenant lawyer in Greater Boston, Espada is a professor of English at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. So welcome again to this session. And without further ado, I give you Martín Espada.
Muchas gracias. Bienvenidos a todos. Many thanks to Professor Oscar Sarmiento, compañero, friend, translator, poet, teacher. I owe him a great debt going back many years. I also want to thank my wife, Lauren, for being present on every page of this book. It is indeed dedicated to her. I'm going to read 6 poems from my new book, Floaters, tonight, and then we will have the opportunity to take your questions in the chat. And by the way, feel free to drop those questions in the chat as the reading goes along. I'm going to start with the first poem in the book. It's called Jumping Off the Mystic Tobin Bridge. Now, 30 years ago, I was a tenant lawyer with Su Clínica Legal, a legal services program for low-income Spanish-speaking tenants in Chelsea, Massachusetts, right across the Mystic Tobin Bridge from Boston. My clients came from Puerto Rico, from the Dominican Republic, but also from Central America, especially from El Salvador and Guatemala. The same people, in other words, crossing our southern border today, fleeing the same countries left in ruins by Ronald Reagan's wars. The second half of this poem refers to the notorious Chuck Stewart murder case in Boston. And so we begin here with the poem Jumping Off the Mystic Tobin Bridge. I close my eyes and see him windmilling his arms as he plummets from the mystic Tobin Bridge to prove me wrong, to show me he was good, to atone for sins like seeds in the lopsided apple of his heart, but mostly to escape from me in the back of his cab, a Puerto Rican lawyer in a suit and tie. I hated the 111 bus, sweltering in my suit and tie with the crowd in the aisle, waiting to hit a bump on the mystic Tobin Bridge so my head would finally burst through the ceiling like a giraffe on a circus train. I hated the 111 bus after eviction day in Chelsea District Court, translating the landlords and judges into Spanish so the tenants knew they had to stuff their clothing into garbage bags and steal away again. Away from the 40-watt squint that followed them everywhere, that followed me because I stood beside them in court. I would daydream in the humidity of the bus, a basketball hero flipping the balled up pages of the law into the wastebasket at the office as the legal aid lawyers chanted my name. I hated the 111 bus. I had to take a taxi cab that day. "What the hell you doing here?" said the driver of the cab to me in my suit and tie. "You gotta be careful in this neighborhood. There's a lot of Jose's around here." The driver's great-grandfather staggered off a boat so his great-grandson could one day drive me across the mystic Tobin Bridge, but there was no room in the taxi but chalk and a blackboard. He could hear the sawing of my breath as I leaned into his ear past the bulletproof barricade somehow missing and said, "I'm a Jose." I could see the 40-watt squint in his rearview mirror. "I'm Puerto Rican," I said. It was exactly 5 p.m. and we were stuck in traffic in a taxi on the mystic Tobin Bridge. The driver stammered his own West Side story without the ballet, how a Puerto Rican gang stole his cousin's wallet years ago. "You think I'm going to rob you?" I said in my suit and tie, close enough now to tickle his ear with the mouth of a revolver. I could hear the sawing of his breath. He still wanted to know what I was doing there. "I'm a lawyer. I go to court with all the Jose's," I said. Stalled traffic steamed around us, the breath of cattle in the winter air. "Where you going for the holidays?" the driver said. I thought about Christmas Eve in court, eviction orders flying from the judge's bench when tenants without legal aid lawyers or children old enough to translate the English of the summons did not answer to their names. Every year, the legal aid lawyers told a joke about the Christmas defense. "Your Honor, it's Christmas." I said to the driver, "I will be spending Christmas right here with my fellow Jose's." The driver shouted, "What do you want me to do? Get out of this cab and jump off the bridge?" We both knew what he meant. We both knew about Chuck Stewart, the last man to jump off the mystic Tobin Bridge. Everybody knew how Chuck drove his wife to Mission Hill after birthing classes, the flash and pop in the dark when he shot her in the head and himself in the belly. Everybody knew how he conjured a black carjacker on the crackling call to 911, the way the Mercury Theater on the air conjured Martians in New Jersey on the radio half a century before. Everybody knew how 100 cops pounded on door after door in the projects of Mission Hill, locking a black man in a cage for the world to see, like the last of his tribe on exhibit at the World's Fair. Everybody knew how Chuck would have escaped, cashing the insurance check to drive away with a new Nissan, but for his brother's confession, the accomplice throwing the Gucci bag with makeup, the wedding rings, and the gun off the dizzy bridge in Revere. Everybody knew how Chuck parked his new car on the lower deck, left a note, and launched himself deep into the black water, how the cops hauled his body from the river by lunchtime when I walked into the office to tell the secretary. Chuck Stewart just jumped off the Mystic Tobin Bridge. I said nothing to the driver. I almost nodded yes in the rearview mirror. I confess, for a flash, I wanted him to jump. The driver, the cops, the landlords, the judges all wanted us to jump off the Mystic Tobin Bridge. All wanted us to sprout gills like movie monsters so we could paddle underwater back to the islands, down into the weeds and mud at the bottom, past the fish-plucked rib cages of the dead, the rusty revolvers of 1,000 crimes unsolved, the wedding rings of marriages gone bad, till we washed up on shore in a tangle of seaweed, gasping for air. Last night, still more landed here, clothing stuffed in garbage bags to flee the god of hurricanes flinging their houses into the sky, or the god of hunger slipping his knife between the ribs. Not a dark tide like the tide of the Mystic River, but builders of bridges. You can walk across the bridges they build, or you can jump. Thank you. Thank you for your golden hands. And also, again, feel free to use the chat, drop comments, whatever you like, or questions. I'm going to read the title poem now, Floaters. Two Salvadoran migrants, father and daughter, who came to be known as Oscar and Valeria, drowned crossing the Rio Grande in June of 2019. A photograph of their bodies went viral, sparking outrage, sparking grief, and also sparking trutherism. A post in the I'm 1015 Border Patrol Facebook group charged that the photograph was a fake. The poem speaks to that photograph and to these charges. Floaters takes its title from the term used by certain members of the Border Patrol to describe those who drown crossing over. Floaters. Epigraph. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and ask, have y'all ever seen floaters this clean? I'm not trying to be an ass, but I have never seen floaters like this. Could this be another edited photo? We've all seen the Dems and liberal parties do some pretty sick things. Anonymous post, I'm 1015 Border Patrol Facebook group. Like a beer bottle thrown into the river by a boy too drunk to cry. Like the shard of a styrofoam cup drained of coffee, brown as the river. Like the plank of a fishing boat broken in half by the river, the dead float. And the dead have a name. Floaters, say the men of the Border Patrol, keeping watch all night by the river, hearts pumping coffee as they say the word floaters, soft as a bubble, hard as a shoe as it nudges the body to see if it breathes, to see if it moans, to see if it sits up and speaks. And the dead have names. A feast day parade of names. names that dress all in red, names that twirl skirts, names that blow whistles, names that shake rattles, names that sing in praise of the saints. Say, Oscar Alberto Martinez Ramirez. Say, Angie Valeria Martinez Avalos. See how they rise off the tongue, the calling of bird to bird somewhere in the trees above our heads, trilling in the dark heart of the leaves. Say what we know of them now they are dead. Oscar slapped dough for pizza with oven, blistered fingers. Daughter Valeria sang, banging a toy guitar. He slipped free of the apron he wore in the blast of the oven, sold the motorcycle he would kick till it sputtered to life, counted off pesos for the journey across the river, and the last of his 25 years, and the last of her 23 months. There is another name that beats its wings in the heart of the trees. Say, Tania Vanessa Avalos, Oscar's wife and Valeria's mother, the witness, stumbling along the river. Now their names rise off her tongue. Say, Oscar y Valeria. He swam from Matamoros across to Brownsville. The girl slung around his neck, stood her in the weeds on the Texas side of the river, swore to return with her mother in hand, turning his back as fathers do, who later say, I turned around and she was gone. In the time it takes for a bird to hop from branch to branch, Valeria jumped in the river after her father. Maybe he called out her name as he swept her up from the river. Maybe the river drowned out his voice as the water swept them away. Tanya called out the names of the saints, but the saints drowsed in the stupor of birds in the dark, their cages covered with blankets. The men on patrol would never hear their pleas for asylum, watching for floaters, hearts pumping coffee all night on the Texas side of the river. No one, they say, had ever seen floaters this clean. Oscar's black shirt yanked up to the armpits, Valeria's arm slung around her father's neck. Even after the light left her eyes, both face down in the weeds back on the Mexican side of the river. Another edited photo. See how her head disappears in his shirt, the waterlogged diaper bunched in her pants, the blue of the blue cans. The radio warned us about the crisis actors we see at one school shooting after another. The man called Oscar will breathe, sit up, speak, tug the black shirt over his head, shower off the mud, and shake hands with the photographer. Yet, the floaters did not float on the Rio Grande like Olympians showing off the backstroke, nor did their souls float up to Dallas, land of rumored jobs and a president shot in the head as he waved from his motorcade. No bubbles rose from their breath in the mud, light as the iridescent circles of soap that would fascinate a 2-year-old. And the dead still have names. Names that sing in praise of the saints, names of flower and blossoms of white, a cortege of names dressed all in black, trailing the coffins to the cemetery. Carve their names in headlines and gravestones they would never know in the kitchens of this cacophonous world. Enter their names in the book of names. Say, Oscar Alberto Martinez Ramirez. Say, Angie Valeria Martinez Avalos. Bury them in a corner of the cemetery named for the sainted Archbishop of the Poor, shot in the heart saying Mass, bullets bought by the taxes I paid when I worked as a bouncer and fractured my hand 40 years ago, and bumper stickers read, El Salvador is Spanish for Vietnam. When the last bubble of breath escapes the body, may the men who speak of floaters, who have never seen floaters this clean, float through the clouds to the heavens, where they paddle the air as they wait for the saint who flips through the keys on his ring like a drowsy janitor till he fingers the key that turns the lock and shuts the gate on their babble-tongued faces, and they plunge back to earth, a shower of hailstones pelting the river, the Mexican side of the river. Need a moment there. Well, I believe strongly that times of hate call for poems of love. My wife, Lauren, is a poet, a novelist, a committed high school teacher, and the best human being I know. So, of course, I wrote her a love poem in the voice of a giant tortoise. She claims it's autobiographical. Everything in the poem I'm about to read you about Darwin is true, by the way. So, in a different vein, love song of the Galapagos tortoise. I am Lonesome George, the last Galapagos tortoise of Pinta Island. I see Darwin's hairy face on t-shirts and hats, backpacks and mugs. I see the statues. I can read the history books if someone turns the pages. I remember Darwin. I was there the day he landed in the ship named for a dog with floppy ears. He tried to lift me up and strained his groin. He climbed on my saddleback shell and tried to ride me, giggling like a boy on a birthday pony. He slipped off and rolled over in the surf, spitting sand. He watched me plod around in search of cactus to crunch, timing me with a pocket watch. He yelled in my ear to see if I was deaf, and I hissed in his face. He invited my tortoise brothers and sisters to board the Beagle. The crew hauled them up the gangplank as guests of honor. Darwin noted in his journal, young tortoises make excellent soup. Like the pirates and the whalers, the naturalists licked their spoons, soup in their beards, toasting the voyage with glasses of our urine. I am Lonesome George. I crane my leathery neck and hiss at everyone. I tuck my head inside my shell. You call and call my name till I peek out. I am a creature of the tropics who curses the icebergs of December. You dress me up in cardigans, sweaters, and wool scarves for winter. I groan about my gut, intimidating the curious with a drumroll of flatulence. You feed me the cactus of Pinta Island and pizza from the Jersey Shore. I am afraid of the toaster and dream of Darwin's beard caught in its coils. You are afraid of nothing as you make waffles jump from the glowing machine. I plod down the road as cars honk behind me, seafarers hungry for soup. You let me steer the car, even though the world is blurry, and you yell in my ear when the other cars cruise like pirate ships through stop signs. I will hiss at the next TV reporter who calls me Lonesome George. This world teems with pirates, Whalers and naturalists on parade, waving their spoons in the air, craving the delicacy of buttery tortoise flesh. But now I crane my neck to croak the love song of the Galapagos tortoise for you, and you swear I am your Frank Sinatra, I am your Sam Cooke, I sing better than Darwin. There are all kinds of love poems. This next one is for a man by the name of Jack Agueros, Agueros, with those two dots over the U. Jack Agueros was a New York, Puerto Rican poet, playwright, essayist, translator, and the director of El Museo del Barrio in East Harlem. He was also my second father. This poem is for him, and it's called Flan, for Jack Agueros, 1934 to 2014. I was 8 when the blackout struck and the lights died all across the city like a massacre of fireflies. In the projects of Brooklyn, I steered myself to 14F, fingers spread against the cool tiles of the hallway past the concrete and chicken wire terrace where I once burnt ants with a magnifying glass. Many years later, at the Chinese restaurant uptown, Jack said, "They got any flan here?" He was my first poet. I had seen the fireflies in his sonnets blink and float away. Fulano, the philosopher in the unemployment line. Blanco, the painter, painting in the madhouse. Monterosa, the dealer killed by shotgun in a bar on Avenue A. His mother, the seamstress, and that quick needle of her sewing machine. Jack, the moving man, his hands sliced raw. He stacked his apartment with dictionaries in 3 languages. I knew the raconteur's grin with every tale. Raul Julia is a friend of mine, a Puerto Rican playing Macbeth. He took 14 curtain calls on opening night. Maybe he would tell me now that flan was not Puerto Rican or Mexican or Spanish, but Chinese, invented by a trembling cook to satisfy the palate of an emperor in the Ming dynasty. "No flan, Jack," I said. "This is a Chinese restaurant." 2 minutes later, he said, "They got any flan?" I showed him the dog-eared and finger-printed menu. "No flan," I said. When the waiter unfurled his pad, Jack said to him, "You got flan?" He sang this song for an hour. The egg roll was not flan. The fried rice was not flan. The fortune cookie was not flan. "Can we get some flan?" he said. "God damn it, Jack," I said. The poets crowded into the bar, striding to the mic. Jack stood with poem in hand, read the title, tilted his head, and said it again, studied the page as if the words shriveled up like ants burnt under a magnifying glass, then sat down. I witnessed the massacre of fireflies. A few of us clapped, not knowing what to do with our hands, staring at the sonneteer who lost all his quatrains and couplets in the denim jacket he left on the subway, the words of Fulano still waiting on the unemployment line. The faster you spin, the stiller you look. There's something to learn in that. But what? After the diagnosis, I handed Jack a book of poems. He dangled the book upside down like a stiff mouse by the tail, something we would sniff behind the refrigerator. I wanted sonnets. Jack kept singing the chorus of a song. Get me to the church, get me to the church, get me to the church on time. At the end, I leaned over Jack's bed to read his own poem in his ear, but some words come home after the blackout, fingers crawling on the wall. I know what I should have said at the Chinese restaurant. Jack, let's get some flan. We should have braved the subway at rush hour, strap hangers rocking all the way to 14th Street and 8th Avenue to La Taza de Oro, gone now like Jack for rice and beans, quid in its own ink, café con leche y flan, Jack. A spoonful of flan for you, after all the years of sonnets and bread for me. The steam rising when your hands crack the crust at the table. I'll read two more. You may have noticed that there are also links in the chat related to some of the poems I've been reading. I want to thank Vanessa for dropping the links in the chat tonight, and for doing the tech behind the scenes. These last two poems have something to do with my father. I'm from the East New York section of Brooklyn and the Linden Projects. My father, Frank Espada, was a community organizer and a documentary photographer. It's an early morning in 1968. Death rides the elevator in Brooklyn. On a winter morning in 1968, my father left to walk the picket line. He rode the elevator in his black coat, hood over his head in the hour before daybreak. On the third floor, the doors opened. A white man waiting for the elevator stood there, peered at my father in his black coat and hood in his brown skin, then screamed and fled. The doors closed. My father laughed on the picket line that morning. He laughed for years. The guy thought I was death, he would say. Death rides an elevator in Brooklyn. Mugger, death. Militant, death. Puerto Rican, death. Listening to the story, as the screaming man screamed louder with every telling, I never thought one day my father would be the man standing there waiting for the elevator doors to open. He did not stare or scream or run. He stepped into the elevator and the doors closed behind him. And this is the last poem I'll read, after which I'll take your questions, of course. My father, Francisco Luis Espada, Frank Espada, was born in Utuado, Puerto Rico, up in the mountains in the year 1930, and died in Pacifica, California in 2014. When Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico in the fall of 2017, I saw Utuado everywhere, over and over, on TV, on the internet, in the headlines. As John Lee Anderson put it in the pages of the New Yorker, Utuado had become, quote, a byword for the island's devastation. At least 3,000 people died in Puerto Rico, according to one study. Another study says it was well over 4,000. I started talking to my father, who died 3 years before. Actually, I started talking to his ashes in a box, and that was the basis of this last and final poem. Letter to my father, October 2017. You once said, my reward for this life will be 1,000 pounds of dirt shoveled in my face. You were wrong. You are 7 pounds of ashes in a box, a Puerto Rican flag wrapped around you next to a red brick from the house in Utuado where you were born, all crammed together on my bookshelf. You taught me there is no God, no life after this life, so I know you are not watching me type this letter over my shoulder. When I was a boy, you were God. I watched from the 7th floor of the projects as you walked down into the street to stop a public execution. A big man caught a small man stealing his car, and everyone in Brooklyn heard the car alarm wail of the condemned. He's killing me. At a word from you, the executioner's hand slipped from the hair of the thief. The kid was high, was all you said when you came back to us. When I was a boy, and you were God, we flew to Puerto Rico. You said, my grandfather was the mayor of Utuado. His name was Buenaventura. That means good fortune. I believed in your grandfather's name. I heard the tree frogs chanting to each other all night. I saw banana leaf and elephant palm sprouting from the mountain's belly. I gnawed the mango's pit, and the sweet yellow hair stuck between my teeth. I said to you, you came from another planet. How'd you do it? You said, every morning, just before I woke up, I saw the mountains. Every morning, I see the mountains. And Utuado, 3 sisters, all in their 70s, all bedridden, all Pentecostales who only left the house for church, lay sleeping on mattresses spread across the floor when the hurricane gutted the mountain the way a butcher slices open a dangled pig, and a rolling wall of mud buried them, leaving the 4th sister to stagger into the street, screaming like an unheeded prophet about the end of the world. In Utuado, a man who cultivated a garden of aguacate and carambola, feeding the avocado and star fruit to his nieces from New York, so that trees in his garden beheaded all at once like the soldiers of a beaten army, and so hanged himself. In Utuado, a welder and a handyman rigged a pulley with a shopping cart to ferry rice and beans across the river where the bridge collapsed, witnessed the cart swaying above so many hands that raised a sign that told the helicopters, Campamento Los Olvidados, Camp of the Forgotten. Los Olvidados wait 7 hours in line for a government meal of Skittles and Vienna sausage, or a tarp to cover the bones of a house with no roof as the fungus grows on their skin from sleeping on mattresses drenched with the spit of the hurricane. They drink the brown water, waiting for microscopic monsters in their bellies to visit plagues upon them. A nurse says, "These people are going to have an epidemic. These people are going to die." The president flips rolls of paper towels to a crowd at a church in Guaynabo, Zeus lobbing thunderbolts on the locked ward of his delusions. Down the block, cousin Ricardo, Bernice's boy, says that somebody stole his can of diesel. I heard somebody ask you once if Puerto Rico needed to be free, and you said, "Tres pulgadas de sangre en la calle." 3 inches of blood in the street. Now 3 inches of mud flow through the streets of Utuado, and troops patrol the town as if guarding the vein of copper in the ground, as if a shovel digging graves in the backyard might strike the ore below, as if La Brigada swinging machetes to clear the road might remember the last uprising. I know you are not God. I have the proof. 7 pounds of ashes in a box on my bookshelf. Gods do not die, and yet I want you to be God again. Stride from the crowd to seize the president's arm before another roll of paper towels sails away. Thunder Spanish obscenities in his face. Banish him to a roofless rainstorm in Utuado so he unravels one soaked sheet after another till there is nothing left but his cardboard heart. I promised myself I would stop talking to you, white box of gray grit. You were deaf even before you died. Hear my promise now. I will take you to the mountains where houses lost like ships at sea rise blue and yellow from the mud. I will open my hands. I will scatter your ashes. En Utuado. Muchas gracias. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, that concludes our reading segment for the session. And we will have now a Q&A as promised. I just wanted to show you, to begin with, that I have my own copy of Floaters. This is the book. This is the book. So if you enjoy the poems, you might decide, it's time for you to buy a copy and enjoy more poems next week, maybe, or in the days to come. So we do have, Martin, we do have questions and comments, and I'm just going to read the first one that was sent to me only by Camilo Perez Bustillo. So Camilo is saying, you continue to be a unique, crucial voice in defense of human rights on both sides of the US-Mexico border and throughout the world. This includes your early support for the April 30th mobilization in El Paso, seeking to draw national attention to the plight of over 2,000 migrant children sleeping in unjust conditions of confinement tonight in settings never intended for children, like Fort Bliss. Where do you draw inspiration from as crimes like these or those of police violence continue to afflict us despite the change in presidential administrations?
Well, first of all, I would like to welcome Camilo Perez Bustillo to our program this evening. Camilo is a human rights lawyer. He's a border rights advocate. He is actually joining us from Taiwan. He is a law professor visiting at the university in Taipei, and it's a 12-hour time difference over there. So he's actually, he got up with the sunrise to be with us this evening, well, or this morning for him. The question of inspiration. Where do I draw inspiration at a time like this? And I have to say that I draw inspiration from the people who don't stop fighting, the people who don't give up. And I think of people like Camilo. I think of his friends in the organization called Witness at the Border. And if you're interested in learning what's really going on at our southern border, you have to go right to the source. You have to go to the organizations and the organizers who are on the ground. And that's Witness at the Border, witnessattheborder.org. Check it out, and you'll get a different perspective. I take inspiration from the people who realize that if you look at history, the great changes don't come from the White House. They come from our house. They come from people like Josh Rubin, the co-founder of this organization, Witness at the Border, who began all by himself, standing there with a sign across the street from an internment camp for adolescent migrants in Tornillo, Texas. Just one guy. And then he was joined by another and another and another. And then the press showed up. And after the press showed up, the politicians showed up. And the next thing you know, that encampment was closed. And then they did the same thing in Florida. We are always, when faced with great social problems and great social contradictions, also faced with our sense of hopelessness and helplessness. What can I do? I'm only one person. Well, quite aside from, write a check, which some of us can do, and frankly, some of us can't, you can also do whatever it is that moves your conscience, whatever it is you feel is the right thing to do, the ethical thing to do. And I think of people like that who have changed the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has really changed the world. So while Biden is a vast improvement over that monster who preceded him, he also looks good in comparison to the monster. And I think we have to keep in mind that even though much of his agenda is progressive, what's happening on the border is not. And in a way, the Republicans have identified this issue and the Democrats have responded the way they used to respond to the whole charge of being soft on crime. Remember that the Democrats were supposed to be soft on crime and the Republicans were tough on crime? And so what happened? We had Bill Clinton, a Democrat, sign this legislation that's still penalizing people in our community today. We have to keep in mind that at the end of the day, a human being is a human being. And that border is invisible. That's a line that isn't there. And I remember going to that border with an activist in his Jeep, and he said, "You see that clump of grass over there?" I said, "Yeah." "California." "See that clump of grass over there?" "Yeah." "Mexico." At the end of the day, these are human beings. They're human beings, and they're being stacked up as if they're firewood. And they're children, all right? The most vulnerable of human beings. What's it going to take before we decide that they are as human as we are? And we start putting pressure on our government to recognize that. So I would begin there.
Next question is by one of my students, Marilyn Miro. If you could tell your younger writing self anything, what would it be?
Write better. What would I tell my younger self? I think it begins with looking at your own work and striking the balance between the creative and the critical. You want the poetry to come. You want the words to flow. You want the images to keep coming. But you also want to be able to improve on what it is you've written. And I, over the years, have become more and more of a believer in revision. Writing is rewriting what you've already rewritten. I am a very big believer in making each word and each line in a poem justify itself. And so when I read it to myself, and by the way, I read it out loud, right? When people wonder, well, where's the music coming from in your poems? That's where I'm composing out loud. I'm reading it out loud. I want those words to resonate that way musically. And if a word or a line doesn't justify its existence, out it comes. And, I may have liked that word or that line. I may have felt good about it. We may have been friends at one time. And so I will convince myself that I'll put that word or that line in another poem. I console myself that way. Oh, don't worry about it. You'll be back. Once in a while, that actually happens. Once in a while, I remember, oh yeah, I took you out of this poem. I'm going to drop you in that poem. And then I feel better about it, less guilty. But at the end of the day, you have to make the poem the best it can be by that wildly subjective standard that all poets have. And so it means doing that. It means being able to focus in that way. And without being too hard on yourself and then turning off the spigot of words entirely.
We have a comment by Molly Wharton. That was absolutely stunning. Thank you for being here with us today. The second comment by Hannah Manning. Mi novio es de Massachusetts. Él conoce esos lugares. Él está escuchando conmigo y dice bravo también.
Bravo.
A question by Sofia Echeverria. What was the inspiration behind your poem, My Cockroach Lover?
Oh, that's an old poem. What was the inspiration behind the poem, My Cockroach Lover? Cockroaches. I was on a first name basis with many of them. And I actually, one summer, I was living with a friend of mine by the name of JC, went by his initials. And this place was just overrun with roaches. And I don't mean just a situation where you flip on the light in the kitchen at night and you get that sort of, Indy 500 of roaches, This was more than that. I mean, the roaches were in the kitchen sink. And so you turn on the water and you have cockroach Navy funeral. The roaches would crawl on you when you slept at night. And I was, of course, his permanent guest on the couch. And so I can remember waking up a few times, slapping myself. And I don't know why, but there's a big difference between slapping a mosquito and slapping a cockroach. Just trust me, there is. You don't want to test this theory. And so one night, I had a dream. I was sleeping on the couch, and I dreamt there was this giant cockroach leaning over me, whispering, "I love you." So I woke up slapping myself, and I realized this was a dream. And that made me sad because it meant the cockroach did not really love me. I was lonely.
The next question is by Tori Kramer. Why did you start writing poetry?
The first poem I wrote was based on a prompt from a teacher in a class. That was the very first poem I wrote. And actually, it was about rain, oddly enough. I'm looking out the window right now, and we have, as usual, um, uh, terrific rainstorm. There's always something falling out of the sky here in Western Massachusetts. Rain, hail, snow, occasionally space junk. But that is how it began when I was 15 years old. And I subsequently wrote more poems on my own. I wrote poetry before knowing what it was. I wrote poetry before I started reading it, which is not what I recommend. I think the best way to begin writing poetry is to also read it. Having said that, you got to have something to say, and I did.
Next one is a comment by my colleague and poet, Dr. Vicky Levitt. Floaters, magnificent and heartbreaking. It reads like a haiku to me. Then a question by Tori Kramer. What court case was Alabanza based on?
Court case?
Yes.
Alabanza was not based on a court case. It was a 9/11 poem. And it's probably my best known poem. It's for the food service workers who were killed that day. Most of them immigrant and many of them undocumented, invisible in life, even more invisible in death. And that's why I wrote the poem. And we're coming up on the 20th anniversary of 9/11 now. So I'll be reading that poem somewhere.
Question by Seth Denny. You have a very elegant way of performing your poetry that is captivating. Do you have any advice you can give to help achieve better tonality and overall expression in our own work?
Well, it helps to have a good microphone. I am actually speaking into something called the Blue Yeti Nano, which is a podcast quality mic. And I realized I had to acquire an external microphone once, of course, the pandemic hit and we went into lockdown and everything became virtual. Because to me, nothing matters more than the sound quality. I have radio experience, and that's what you hear. Sometimes I have some theater experience, and that's what you hear sometimes. I think it's very important. I remember I took a workshop once with Allen Ginsberg, who I knew slightly, on reading your work aloud. And he was a very, very good reader. Those of you might remember Allen Ginsberg performing his poetry. He was a terrific reader. And he said to us, remember, you need to bite the consonants and swallow the vowels. Bite the consonants and swallow the vowels. Right? So there is that kind of enunciation that you hear in my performance of the poems. I am also just sort of feeling the poem as I go. I am thinking the thought. I am re-experiencing the emotion, and you'll hear that sometimes. It'll come out in the timbre of my voice. My voice will get lower, or it might become more gravelly, just because I am feeling the poem more intensely at that moment. It's hitting me all over again. And sometimes I do bad things to myself. Dirty tricks. So you recall, of course, that I read a very short poem about my father, followed by the last poem of the evening, Letter to My Father. I discovered that those poems go well together for the audience, but also for me. That first poem, the short one, Death Rides the Elevator in Brooklyn, is so quiet and so sad to me. I start to re-experience the loss of my father, who died 7 years ago. by the time I get to that last poem, I am feeling it much more deeply. And so there's a certain quality that comes out in my voice. And because I'm going there again emotionally, and I know I'm doing that to myself. How's that for weird?
The next question is by Kyra Lopez. How reserved or free are you when exploring experiences and people you know firsthand in your writing?
Okay. Could you repeat the question? How reserved or free? Okay, I see it. How reserved or free are you when exploring experiences and people you know firsthand in your writing? I think this has to do with writing about other people. And of course, first of all, let me be very clear, there are things I can't write about, things I can't say. On the other hand, there are things I have said in my poetry that have gotten me into trouble. With my father, for example, no longer with us, who once said something like this. He said, "That never happened. And besides, you should wait till people are dead to write things like that." And I stopped and thought about it. Oh, yeah. Sometimes people at the other extreme, they come to me when they know they have a story to tell and they want me to tell it. My father would do that too. There were things he wanted me to talk about, things he didn't want me to talk about. When he had a story to tell, and he was a raconteur, just like I mentioned Jack, my father would tell stories, and sometimes he wanted me to take that story and put it in the form of a poem. And he didn't come right out and say, "Put that in a poem, why don't you?" But the fact of the matter is I would do that, and he liked that. There are other people who have done similar things. Sometimes I write a poem about someone. I'll run it back. I'll run it by them. I'll say, "Did I get this right? Is that what happened? Is this what happened?" Right? Not that I have to stick 100% to the facts in chronological order as they happen. This is not journalism, it's poetry. And most people realize that. You're going to take some liberties, the same way you would if you were making a little movie. And that's, to me, what many of these poems are. They're just little movies in my head with a budget of 0. And I get to cast all the parts. And then when you hear them, you cast all the parts. And the great thing is, we don't have to spend millions on that. It's like Marge Piercy once said, "Writers write books, banks make movies." Well, if you're a poet, you get to make your own little movie.
The next question is by Diamond Lauren. Is there a certain place that you feel inspires you the most in your poetry writing?
I have written many poems inspired in one way or the other by the island of Puerto Rico. And every single book, there have been 20 books, more than 20 books. Every book has some poems about Puerto Rico. And there are times when I will interpret the world through that lens. The last poem I wrote for this book, and that the book, had to go to press, so to speak, go into production about a year ago. And the last poem I put in there was a poem that was a commentary on both the pandemic and the rise of the racial reckoning, the social justice movement after the murder of George Floyd. So what did I do? I wrote a poem about a cholera epidemic in Puerto Rico in 1856 and the subsequent rise of an abolitionist movement on the island, actually simultaneous with the cholera epidemic, led by Dr. Ramon Emeterio Betances. And then Betances went from there to organizing a revolution to throw out the colonial overlords, the Spanish, something that happened in 1868 called El Grito de Lares. So, because it was an allegory. It was an allegory. Here you have in Puerto Rico in 1856, this epidemic, it actually was a pandemic because cholera was breaking out everywhere in the world. And from that came a social justice movement, the abolition of slavery. And from that came a revolutionary movement to get rid of an imperial power, Spain. And, I thought if they could do it in the middle of the 19th century in that tiny Caribbean island, that we can do it here and now and make the world a better place coming out of this, the cataclysms of racial violence, racial oppression by the state, and COVID-19. So there's a prism. That's the way sometimes I see the world, But obviously, the last poem I read in the book, from the book, it's a poem about the island, and part of what I do when I'm drawing inspiration from the island is I am also reminding people that the island is still there. It didn't sink in the ocean. It didn't float away. It wasn't bought by France. It's still there. And it's very important to issue that reminder. And for all that the Hurricane Maria hit in the fall of 2017, it might as well have been 1856 for the way that people have already forgotten about it. So I'm there to be, that that guy, the one who reminds you.
I think that I'm going to go over two more questions before we finish.
Okay.
Because we have been highly successful. I think we have plenty of questions, but I don't think we'll have enough time to answer them all.
Yeah, no, I was actually seeing some of the questions in the chat, and actually this is a good juncture also to remind people that if you're interested in floaters, Vanessa has dropped the link to buy this book through something called bookshop.org. And if you don't know about bookshop.org, you should. It's an alternative to Amazon. You don't have to go to Amazon. You can buy the book at the link that Vanessa just dropped. Bookshop.org is supports independent bookstores. That's where most of the money goes, and you get a discount on top of that, which you need because, well, let's face it, it's a hardcover book.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So here we have the two questions, las últimas preguntas. Kimberly Amiron, who are some other poets who inspire your work?
Well, you heard me talk about one of them in the poem Flan, and that's Jack Agüeros. Jack Agüeros. His books are still out there. They're still in print, even though Jack died in 2014. He actually he died only a couple of months after my father, as a matter of fact. But I want to make sure to tell you about poets like Jack, because it's easy enough for me to say, oh, go and read so-and-so. Go and read the poets you've already heard about, the canon. You don't need me for that. I would rather tell you about someone like Jack Agüeros. I know we have lots of people tonight listening who are studying with Oscar Sarmiento and Spanish language literature. It's important to remember that they're still out there. That literature is still out there. One of the most important elements in humanizing people is the recognition of their poetry, the fact that they too are capable of creating poetry. So let's not forget, when we talk about the people who are crossing the southern border, they have their poets too. I think of the people who are coming, for example, from El Salvador. And that puts me in mind of Roque Dalton, Dalton, Roque Dalton. Right, a wonderful poet. I think of the poets like Claribel Alegría, who was actually as memory serves, she was half Nicaraguan and half Salvadoran, and I knew her. And Claribel was a poet and a novelist. Camilo just dropped an important name in the chat. You think about the people crossing the border from Guatemala. Before we simply categorize them as victims, let's remember they too have a great literature. Otto René Castillo, great poet from Guatemala. Camilo also mentions the name of Ernesto Cardenal, the great poet priest from Nicaragua. Widely translated, you can find his work everywhere. And I was deeply influenced by all these poets, but especially by Jack Agüeros at the beginning there, and by Ernesto Cardenal. Jack, as I mentioned, was my second father, it was very close. Ernesto Cardenal was someone I had the opportunity to meet and spend time with on several occasions. He just died recently, died last year. He was 95 years old, but you could pick up 0 Hour and other poems by Ernesto Cardenal. He wrote historical epics about Central America, or you could pick up his epigrams, very, very short, very funny, satirical poems. All of these poets are available in translation. And it so happens they're all collected in an anthology I edited years ago called Poetry Like Bread, Poets of the Political Imagination from Curbstone Press, Poetry Like Bread. And, you know, all for, except for Jack, Roque Dalton, Claribel Alegría, Otto René Castillo, Neto Car. And this humanizes those people crossing the border, that they too write poetry. They come from cultures just like us.
And the last question is by William Dimir. El Salvador is Spanish for Vietnam. She quotes you. That line impacted me so much. I also saw the photo inspired by the floater's poem. How does the process of writing this poem look like? What was the thought process like to find the strength to write this poem?
Well, some poems begin life as an argument. That poem began life as an argument. Of course, I saw the same viral photograph that most of you saw, the one that Vanessa dropped into the chat tonight as I was reading the poem. It's horrifying, but how do you make a poem out of horror? I needed to have an argument, and that that post in the I'm 1015 Border Patrol Facebook group gave me an argument, because it was someone denying the obvious horror, you know, and I saw people all around me who were absolutely stunned by that image. And here are people, Trumpists, people within the Border Patrol who are denying that this, in fact, is a photograph of this father and daughter, and you know, it was a small taste of what would happen during the election and after the election at the end of last year. That capacity to completely deny reality, that capacity to live in a world full of conspiracy theories and rationalize a total lack of compassion, a total lack of empathy. And that's the kind of mentality, the kind of thinking that we have to argue with, push back against. And so that's what made it happen. You know, now what carried me the rest of the way was that, you know, I didn't have any expectation that the person who posted that comment was going to read my poem and have a change of heart and, you know, and suddenly become a convert. You know, I didn't have that in mind. It was a way of, you know, in some ways it was me, you know, wrestling with these ghosts, and it was me trying to confront all of it at once, not just the dead but the living, and the realization that you know that this was going to happen again. And make no mistake, it's still happening. You know, as we choke off legal opportunities for people to come to this country, as we effectively prevent anyone from applying for asylum on the southern border, we are sending them out into the river. We're sending them out into the desert. And of course, they're being thrown back into their countries of origin. Camilo just dropped this in the chat, and he ought to know. Back to the 1980s, Mexico and Central America are being militarized again as we speak to deter mass migration from Central America. Witness at theborder.org. Yes, absolutely. Oscar y Valeria presente ahora y siempre. And that bumper sticker. Yeah, I remember that bumper sticker. And that bumper sticker was very, very popular. It was everywhere for a time, because people in the 1980s had a fresh memory of the war in Vietnam. And they knew that they didn't want that to happen again. They also understood the whole idea that you could send proxy armies out there to do your killing for you. So instead of the unpopular draft, and instead of those boys, because they were boys mostly, coming back in body bags and coming back in coffins, you know, to this country, more than 50,000. Well, let's pour $1 million a day into the Salvadoran military, and they can do the dirty work for us. As Camilo says in the chat, U.S. presence confirmed this week at the El Mozote massacre trial in San Salvador, 1981. El Mozote massacre, 1,000 people killed by the Salvadoran military, approximately half of them children. We now have confirmation there was at least one U.S. military advisor present. And, you know, much as we like to think that these things will never happen again, it's not osmosis. It's up to us. It's up to you. You know, and whether it's something you take care of in the ballot box, or by writing a poem, or getting into an argument at the dinner table, whatever it might be, it's up to you. Punto.
Well, just to end the session, then I would like to again thank the LoKo Art Festival for the funding, for the poetry session, and for the presence of Martín Espada at my class session this afternoon. I especially thank you all for attending the session tonight. My colleagues, I see some from my college and from St. Lawrence University as well. So thank you for coming, and thank you especially to Martín Espada for being with us. I think we owe him the last clap of the night before we end. Thank you for coming.
Muchas gracias, Oscar. Muchas gracias.
Gracias a ti. Gracias a ti.